Zoom plus PowerPoint is going to be an interesting technical issue to maneuver. Sanford, can you hear me? Are you?
I can hear you. I can hear you. Yeah.
And
I thank you for walking me through this so far. Okay. I just got in. I don't know what you guys are talking about, nor where you're at,
yeah,
nor
no,
how you. Shall we just begin?
Sure. I was just saying, Marrikka is going to be on later on this afternoon at 8 o'clock in the evening EST, 5 o'clock PST, and Hanan is going to be on right after this. So there's also been a session that's just finished, which was on AI and the Office of the Future. I can really recommend that. I was surprised. I did not think a talk about the Office of the Future was going to be interesting, even from, and especially not from a philosophical, theoretical point of view, but it actually is. I'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow, but it's super fascinating. And the talk is going to be online, and I recommend everyone to have a look at that. I'll maybe refer to it tomorrow, but anyway, Sanford, so it's fantastic. So for those of you who are new to joining this, this is the third day of a week of shared talks. We are kind of passing on the baton as in a relay for one another. I was on the first day, then Antoine on second day, Sanford today. Tomorrow I take up the baton again, and then we go through until the end. Marrikka is going to come in and with the glory leg in a relay and finish us off. So I'm hoping at some stage we're going to get more time for questions out there. I know that there's some fantastic people in the audience. If not today, certainly on the final day, we'll have a lot of time for questions. But okay, so Sanford.
Well, first let me say at the outset that what I've prepared is really rather short and intended as a provocation, certainly to those on the panel. On the other hand, it would also, should that not perhaps engage them as it might, there would be time. So I'm going to let you, as the impresario, I'm going to let you figure out whether or not and how you may want to engage, the broader audience. I am staggered how you do all of this, how you see so much of the programming that you've arranged, and how you also answer my emergency texts within seconds of me sending them to you. So I want to say I thank you, and I'm deeply impressed. I feel very disorganized, but to begin with, also my COVID household is living on an absolutely horrific schedule, probably something more like Beijing or Shanghai right now. And it's, I come to these sessions sometimes with terrible, very, very poor sleep behind me. Now, I also just noted by your introduction that you expect a certain number of the participants, some of the audience, to be tuning in maybe for the first time today. I have to say that, my approach to the marathon, the 7-day marathon that we're doing, is really conversational and responsive. And in that sense, and I will try to be as explicit as possible, I'm also largely responding to things that I have heard or that I have enjoyed already in the programming, what little I've been able to attend of it. So in that sense, yeah, the context is somewhat, let's say, anchored in what is emerging, let's say, among us here. Okay, I say that simply because that was for the audience, not for you guys. The other thing is that I scribbled some notes. Look, my initial idea to start off, as you know, was to respond to some of Neil's initial comments, his introduction of the idea of Neil Seth's idea of the controlled hallucination, And I did a bit of preparation for that, but I never really got around to it. So I'll probably do that in my next session. But as I was, well, let me get into it. So I scribbled out these notes. I don't exactly know how long they are. I didn't get a chance to review them this morning, so bear with me. Now, I'm also going to ask for some assistance when it comes time to me finding my, I don't know how to do it. You say, oh, there's the share screen. Gotcha. I'm ready to go, guys. So anyway, these are notes from yesterday. I was from last night. I was included rather late in this forum on artificial intelligence, and I responded when first invited as contrarily as I could, with the idea that I would like to introduce and perhaps even defend the concept of natural intelligence. But of course, Neil knew immediately, and so probably did the others, that there was no way, and there never has been a way, of properly separating artificial intelligence from natural intelligence. On the other hand, there are things that really must be said. And I want to say that it is an incredibly hard thing for me to figure out just where to enter into that, let's say, systematic defense. What I have today is just what emerged as part of a larger campaign, which I feel every morning, I want to say, when I wake up. I had no real precise idea of how I would respond to it. On the other hand, I knew there was a vast sea of topics in this direction to which I am, by deliberate effort and design over the last decades, highly attuned. In other words, this is something I would say that I have been attuned to for virtually most of my life, actually, and certainly most of my professional life. When I say professional life, I'd like to say that in terms of me even being seen as an architecture theorist, in many ways, I would say it is the concern for what lies just outside the boundaries of the cognitive framework, shall we say, of architectural thought, which probably has always condemned me to the position of being seen as an outsider. And again, it's something I've exploited, and in my later years now, I realize it is something that I have now decided is a political and ethical task, one which I affirm and no longer, shall we say, hide or apologize for. I see my role in the design field, and as a writer generally, to be one of contributing to questions by challenging the frame and context of how problems are stated and constructed within our social learning environment. This nearly always means shifting attention from the familiar places and introducing terms, or let's say introducing productive and unfamiliar terms. A theorist's role is not only to invent concepts, but to reconfigure and repopulate landscapes, cognitive landscapes, subjective landscapes, even affordance landscapes. Now, I made a note to myself here that I'd be getting back to this idea of an affordance landscape, and I know now that I will not. So if I take a second here simply to explain what that term means for those who may not be certain what it, who may not have heard it before, and how it fits into subjective and cognitive. An affordance, without going into its history and where it came from, et cetera, generally speaking, refers to these points in an environment where, shall we say, a sentient organism perceives a place of engagement where an effect, let's say, or an advantage can be extracted through engagement with that place. And the classic example would be a doorknob. A doorknob presents, let's say, to a human, a point of engagement in the environment where the simple twist and rotation will permit one, in fact, to produce, say, an aperture and a connection between two rooms. Now, affordance is a beautiful idea. It actually comes out of the world of perceptual psychology, really, or cognitive science. And it implicitly connects, if you like, the organization of the environment with the organization, shall we say, of the living spontaneous entities that populate it, that use it, that create it, and that are in turn, shall we say, shaped and formed and rewarded within that environment. Now, those are that set of words is really important because they typically do not exist in the foreground of our awareness when we design, when we talk about artificial intelligence. And I mean, there's a hell of a lot for actually to master in the field of artificial intelligence, both technical and conceptual. But a proper understanding, as I will argue, of artificial intelligence, which I think in some ways may be possible to say is an unprecedented, form of rationality alongside those great transformers that we have, or let's say as a human culture, as a Western culture, or even maybe non-Western, have experienced along the lines of double entry bookkeeping, the combustion engine, and the printing press, et cetera, and so forth. The ways in which AI not necessarily threaten to transform experience in our environment, but actually penetrate into and transform the ways in which we even imagine the environment, of course, are things that we need to learn. We need to create a kind of a mental hygiene in order better to grasp these, in order even to be able to transform them into language. And to keep them active, if you like, in terms of concepts, in terms of the way we discuss and deploy the opportunities that will present from facing these challenges. I already know that my talk, which was about 20 minutes, is going to go longer because I realize always in the moment when you begin to produce in your head the idea of an interlocutor, that's to say of somebody who is listening, and the subjectivity that you are engaging, in actuality, when it comes time to actually speaking and presenting a lecture, let's say, or presenting a set of ideas, something has already changed. And I am increasingly aware precisely how what is represented by what is going on right here is my attempt in forming an image of a world that I wanted to deposit as something, let's just say, to acknowledge or even to reconcile in the worlds of the interlocutors, of the listeners, the observers outside, in my screen and distributed throughout the world. And in many ways, just as it was described by Antoine yesterday, the concept of the conversation, which I suppose I'll be getting back to, it is a problem of continual mutual transformation and also invention. But I become, of course, increasingly aware of just what it means to having one world rubbing up against another and how much, shall we say, how much deference and how much filling in, how much design, if you like, is required, not only for the signal or for the message, but for the framework that will activate the message, and so on and so forth. So anyway, I do believe, I mean, I again, like many of my generation, have experienced the extraordinary challenges and changes of what it means to walk into a classroom today with a gap in historical experience, which means, in fact, the gap between subjectivities is a bridge that needs continual filling in, but it also requires a clear, shall we say, understanding that building the bridge, which is not the message itself, but rather the conveyor, the vehicle, is a critical part of what is required, if you like, to establish a conversation, and in some ways to continue to preserve the relations and the links that, shall we say, guarantee the coherence of a universe in which subjectivities, materialities, energetics, and information continuums continue, if you like, to sustain the openness and don't, in fact, continually clip or prune, if you like, those relationships. And that I see as a typical and reflexive danger with every new, shall we say, with the, let's say, technological or technical transformation that takes place around us. In other words, to make this very explicit, I know I can get pretty, what is the word? I can get pretty abstract and lost in dependent clauses. I would like to say that without any doubt, we've experienced this before. I certainly have as a theorist. We have a tendency as extraordinarily and even reflexively adaptive organisms to change our horizons in order to accommodate cues in the environment. And what I mean by this is simply this: the advent of AI as a kind of what some people might even wish to refer to as a paradigm, the existence, shall we say, or the insurgence, let's say, of AI subjectivity, even into our curricula, in our design schools and beyond, absolutely, as Neil informs us, of course, who isn't considering the impact of AI in any domain right now, is something that risks, if you like, invisibly and tacitly, because of our adaptive natures, if you like, transforming our horizon without our awareness. I believe it is the task, of course, of the theorist to continually modulate, modify, resist, whatever the words are, etc., constantly be recomposing that horizon. And I don't mean simply in terms of the inherited and traditional horizons, which we know must be swept away, in fact, swept away perhaps at every minute. But we must keep track of what is being displaced at any moment, especially because with every displacement, shall we say, is a universe of opportunities, a universe of possibilities, and so on and so forth. What is at risk here, to say it very, very clearly, is humans' willingness, trained in us virtually since the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, with the advent of these new types of technologies, which essentially engage our love of stimulation, especially motion stimulation, and of information rich, shall we say, streams, which began perhaps we could say with the television, following with the computer, and then with the, shall we say, the saturation of our environment with this kind of technicity which no longer is necessarily fully attached to visible, separable units, shall we say, of experience. In other words, we are, and I've been saying this for 30 years, we as the designers of the environment are tasked with developing a theory of the environment which is not confined, if you like, to the false ontologies of individual entities and objects, because the forces, the organizational forces which constitute our experience are becoming increasingly, shall we say, ambient, saturated. Environmental is a term I used to use. I don't use it anymore because I don't want it to interfere with my current wish, if you like, to affirm certain qualities of the environment. But it really argues that that design has become, let's just say it, it's become a kind of form of ambient intelligence around us. And it is the AI challenge for us is to create a kind of pragmatic, ethical, materialist attitude in which to grasp and engage it. That might have been my whole lecture, by the way. That was all extemporized. That's none of the notes that I particularly have. But I feel if I stated up front, regardless of how difficult that might have been to follow, perhaps what I've written here today, last night, will be a repetition of it and will become more familiar. Now I'm going to move to my next bubble here in my notes. And that perhaps, if I may say it this way, is it's perhaps a way, that's perhaps a reason, shall we say, as I think out loud, why that idea of affordance, I might as well tell you guys, in fact, for those of you who wish to do a little more, a little more follow-up on it, the term was essentially introduced into knowledge by J.J. Gibson. Most people out there probably know J.J. Gibson. J.J. Gibson was a perceptual psychologist who worked particularly on vision and how an organism deploys vision to engage the world and how to use the world. He invented the idea of the affordance because he said that's essentially what vision is oriented to. Now that's a whole other set of arguments, brilliant, bloody arguments, partly because he completely transforms our understanding of space. Especially, I should say this because it's worthwhile and because I guess this is in some ways a kind of a pedagogical opportunity. What Neil has produced here, not just a circus of infotainment, but, Gibson, by the way, whose work has dominated psychology departments throughout the world, and I say dominated, absolutely, absolutely dominated, even to this day. He underwent a kind of epiphany or transformation in his late mid-career, where he discovered what he called, he had done all of this beautiful work, if you like, on vision, and how the organism deploys vision in order to extract information from the environment, understand that environment, construe and in a way invent and project that environment so that use and work, shall we say, could be extracted from it, which is essentially an AI scenario avant la lettre, as some might say. But I don't want to go through Gibson here. What I would like to do is simply refer to the moment where he rejects the entire body of his early work in favor of what he refers to as this is the title of his nowadays most famous and last work. It's called The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. And he deploys and activates that term ecological, which is a term that I would very profoundly like to affirm in my presentation today. And to say it right out, it is what is lacking, if you like, in the way in which to date, I believe AI people, researchers are approaching the problem of AI. But more worryingly, what is lacking in the way in which, shall we say, second order well, developers, shall we say, and I mean by that architects, urbanists, and so on and so forth, are receiving and seeking to deploy the power, shall we say, of AI. What is this ecological? I will just keep it very, very simple here. In the notion of Gibson, what constituted the shift from his early work to his later work, to his affirmation of what he calls the ecological approach to visual perception, is, well, let's just say, to keep it very gross here, is two things. And we've heard these things already, shall we say, partially affirmed in the presentations we've had already. The first is that he realizes that perception cannot be thought of separately from motion. That's to say, from the free movement of the perceiver. And that is an extremely important, we'll just say the implications of that are immense. The political implications included, the ethical implications, but also, frankly, the geometrical and morphological, shall we say, implications. The second is that he discovers, because the characteristic of Gibson's early work was to confine and generate a boundary around the vision problem, and that boundary went around actually the eyeball and the optic nerve. And virtually all of the work in that early phase sought to immobilize the eye and to detail the dynamics, shall we say, and the mechanisms, the geometry of vision from within that very restricted, shall we say, boundary framework. What he discovers, and he says this virtually on the first page of his famous book, The Ecological Approach, and the second great, shall we say, threshold point in his passage from his early work to his late work to the ecological thing, is he discovers, or he affirms, that vision takes place within a much larger context, which is the context of the body. And there's that famous phrase that he uses. He discovers that vision takes place in the eye, which is situated in the head, which is situated in the body, which is standing on the ground, which is moving over that surface and through and by other surfaces, which are also moving through and by those other systems. Now, I'm glad I did this as an extemporized intro, as an extemporized module, shall we say, because it will help, I believe, explain some of the other comments that I prepared regarding the problem of boundaries. So I hope I hope I'm understood in the sense of where it is that I'm going in terms of how all of this really is an AI problem. As we know, for example, from the most, the man in the streets idea of AI, of course, is self-driving automobiles or robots or whatever it be. What we are wishing to do, of course, is to create reliable, responsive human beings so that we can offload, shall we say, a lot of our navigational concerns in the case of cars. Or rather, we could say is, do we really want to, what does it mean in the change of human culture, in the human subjectivity, to seek, if you like, one of the most one of the things that we are most, let's just say, exquisitely designed to do, which is to move and to enjoy that movement in the world and to offload so much of the task, but I would also say enjoyment. By the way, I'm going to radically elaborate that concept of enjoyment because I think it is the crux of the AI problem, or shall we say, it is the crux of the universe that we must construct in order to engage the AI problem. I try to be as explicitly as I can here because I want to tell you this, is that teaching has become a nightmare in the sense of wishing to rely on historical, what people of a certain age these days like to assume are ideas which have been acquired, which we would like to have active in the background of some of the ideas that we developed, but which we know are not. So I like to reactivate them whenever possible. So there we go. I guess what I am going to try to do is leave you all with a feeling or a sense of what I believe a theorist's responsibility and task is today. It is not as such to resist AI. It is not in any sense that. It is to create or to transform, shall we say, the landscape, or to move the boundaries. I'll get into that eventually, I hope, so that AI can be more flexibly seen, or shall we say, more congenially and more richly available to modification, integration, and transformation, to be put, shall we say, at the service of imagination and of human, shall we say, and I don't mind affirming that in its most naive sense at this point, at the sense of aspirations, shall we say, of human aspiration and curiosity, because I do believe that AI's underlying well, I wouldn't say its task, I wouldn't say its motive, but I would say that AI does have a component to it that reforms subjectivity in a way that really does radically limit the position and the role of curiosity, of open curiosity, in, if you like, in the culture, to the degree to which, and especially in designers, they do have a kind of excessive and naive openness, shall we say, to the integration of things which they see as being, shall we say, useful instrumentalizations. Well, okay, so I guess, you know, I'm ranting. And I could have predicted it for sure. Maybe some of you else could have. Though I know this, I would have been very disappointed had I gone through my comments and failed to present some of these things to you, and I'm probably going to continue with them. So I move to my next bubble. As a matter, and it may be redundant, in fact, because I can barely remember what I wrote last night, but as a matter of principle, but also philosophical hygiene, I would like to say that I am a holistic thinker. When I say philosophical hygiene, I say that even if it were not my natural proclivity, it is something that I would, without a doubt, seek to teach myself through discipline to do. And I will say as well that I do everything I can to instill this habit of mind in my students. I am a holistic thinker, and the term I use for this more and more, and I'll re-invoke that term of Gibson's, is more and more ecological thinking. Holistic thinking and ecological thinking are extremely close together. In fact, they overlap immensely. I believe this is, in fact, and I guess, look, guys, I guess I can give you a, let me see if I can do this now. There we go. I'm going to try a share screen thing. I realize, somebody said, it was Neil who very generously and optimistically, I know, said that I may be showing images. Well, frankly, the PowerPoint I started preparing with images is non-existent. I like to present words as images, and I know that most of my design audience actually, without knowing it, can use words as images, and I feel that it's a great way to create memories. Oh, Jesus. I think I left too much open on my screen. So Neil warned me I'd find this. Let me see if I can find, oh my God, PowerPoint. No, this is not going to work. I was, let me try one more time.
Are you clicking on the PowerPoint icon on your screen?
Well, it says open system preferences. Can I just say cancel?
Yeah.
No, I can't. It won't let me proceed. So I open system. Yeah. Okay, guys. Oh, shit. No, I'm going to have to be able to do this. I have, I'll kill you guys. I have one text that PowerPoint. Share. Oh, wait.
Share screen.
No, it asks me to open system preference. Oh, I got to change the security and the privacy. Oh, Jesus.
Is that necessary?
Guys, forget it. I'm not going to be able to get to the more textual parts of. Let me just say this. I can do this through mere. I can do this through mere just emphasis and speaking. So what I would have thrown up, I wanted to throw up ecological thinking. I wanted it to holistic thinking, ecological thinking. Then the next term, which I'm about to use, which I say the ecological thinking, which is the preeminent form of relational thinking. I felt it important at this point in time and history to make sure that term relational thinking, which I know is not common, but which will become more so as a flashpoint of controversy. And I will say, as I say here, which is always transformational thinking. So we had the first PowerPoint slide had those 4 terms. The important ones are not just holistic, though it's important to note that it's important simply that they be grouped together. Holistic, ecological, relational, and finally transformational. Now, the transformational idea is a very important one. I won't be able to get to it all that much in today's talk. It's something that may turn up in the second one. What it means very, very simply is and this was this was very active, actually, in our conversations in the last few sessions, tacitly, not explicitly, but my goal here was to bring these to the foreground and provide language for them so that they would become active values. And what does transformation mean? It means in any engagement, oh boy, I guess you guys are going to hear the coffee being made next to me. In any engagement with the world, let's say, and a user, or in any engagement with two worlds, as I described it earlier, there is always an exchange, shall we say, of energetics, of information, of matter, et cetera, and there is always a transformation of the two systems. Some ecologists have even developed in very elaborate ways exactly the dynamics of how those transformative relations take place. We know this in the work of Howard Odum. The term dyadic transformers was used by a very early physicist and ecologist whose first name I've just forgotten, a guy named Lotka. But it's a very important part of all understanding of ecology and of our cognitive and living environment. Our environment is not inert, of course. I mean, this is an idea that has been continually kicked around and has reached, shall we say, the foreground for the first time in design and architectural theories and so on and so forth, although it remains very poorly theorized, shall we say. It has not been sufficiently analyzed or described, but also it cannot be described as such. The environment can only be understood in terms of its, shall we say, its engagement with the transformers which both populate it and which exist adjacent to it. That's to say, transformation is the characteristic of material life today. And this is what generates the information, not only the information that is sought and captured, shall we say, by AI scenarios, but this metabolization, this perpetual metabolization, shall we say, of the environment and of we who are not just users of the environment, but actually parts of the environment. That is something else that ecological thinking teaches us, is that every life form, every material entity, every, shall we say, unit of information is an equal transformer, an equal part, an equal active interactor of the larger, shall we say, of the larger ecology. So there we go. I would like to say that transformational and dynamical exchanges, shall we use the term now of conversation. By the way, the term conversation is not one that I will, that I do use. I have another term for it, but I would like to say in the context of developing something here with all of you and in the conversation, shall we say, that is taking place in this forum, it is always useful to continually integrate the notions introduced by others, because that's what a conversation is. Somebody says something, when you respond to it, you change the context that the interlocutor, the other party in the conversation, then immediately and spontaneously responds to with a response. It's a magical thing, by the way. There is nothing more magical than how that works. Now, we are not by any means the first to introduce that particular trope of the conversation. It was, I would like to put on the table right now, it was the foundational concept, one could say, of one of the most powerful thinkers, let's just say, of proto-AI, whose name was, oh my gosh, what's his name? Just a moment, guys. Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson. I'd like to invoke the name of Gregory Bateson here in relation to the idea of the conversation that we're having. That Gregory Bateson was a cybernetic psychologist. The genius of his work was to understand that the world, I mean, he was an anthropologist, he was all kinds of things, but the genius for him was to introduce the idea that the environment and the world could only be understood in terms of the continual transformations that took place through exchange, continuous exchange. And he made it the foundational basis of a whole, shall we say, political ecology of thought or of mind. His famous book was called Steps to an Ecology of Mind, actually. How beautiful, how well it fits with the ideas I'm seeking to develop here. When I say proto-ecologist, I can assure you all that in the second or third phase of architects' study of AI, which I know is, it's inevitable. I remember in the 1990s, if I may say this, when AI was considered the rat's ass of computation, when a different version of theorization, shall we say, of the physical environment was taking place, which was known as not artificial intelligence, but artificial life. Now, I don't know where the massive explosion, I mean, there's no other way to say it, of artificial life studies as they profoundly marked all of science, but certainly all architecture profoundly in the 1990s. I don't know where all of that has gone. And when I invoke the idea of artificial life, it is the large umbrella term which underlay the study of everything that some people still feel the interest in motion, dynamical systems theory, chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics, all of those things, if you like, which created that handshake that took place in the 1990s in the design world with the advent computation, and also with the advent of pan-neoliberalism and this, shall we say, this tacit embrace of a certain type of intelligence that people came to believe in, a completely false intelligence, which was market, or what they would call efficient market theory, or simply market, the wisdom of the market, and so on and so forth. I invoke that. I'm not going to try and explain it. Neoliberalism is something everybody more or less knows what it is. Important to understand that it represents a very critical moment in the formation of historical subjectivity that cannot be separated, if you like, from the 1990s, a time when our subjectivity was radically shaped by these new, shall we say, environmental technologies, that's to say, computation, digitization, but especially modeling. So this is a kind of a history which is the absolutely concrete and pressing prehistory of what's happening today in AI. And I have to say, it sounds pedantic, maybe even maybe even pompous, maybe even condescending. But I tell you honestly, you have to understand, you have to believe my sincerity here. The degree to which the reflex to even partly historicize these transformations, which we find so exciting, because they are exciting, and I don't mean exciting to be good, I just mean they are incredibly demanding on those parts of our imagination, if you like, which continually seek, shall we say, novelty and greater understanding, greater, shall we say, greater penetration into the world, into reality, because we know what we have today through our senses and our systems of understanding and our experience is an extraordinarily limited one, not only in terms of what is out there lodged in the world, of what can be known and experienced, but in terms of our human capacities. How we use our own capacities, if you like, has been radically limited. Now, that's where I am going, let's just say, with the natural intelligence, but I can already tell that we're looking at weeks and weeks and weeks of like the beginning to develop the steps to get there. But you need to simply know that if that is the task, it's a very fun route, shall we say, of exploration to get there. AI is on that landscape, rather deeply down there. But I have to say, it is very important, and that's what I like to do. I feel what I need to do, and also what I feel I need to try to excite others to please do, is to begin to fill in and to annex those steps, not only the ones that history took, if you like, in organizing our sensorium to accommodate our technological apparatus, but also to recover those things that were obscured, shall we say, or put out of play by the cues, if you like, that were imposed on our awareness, and which in many ways diverted our attention from the ways in which our biological endowment, shall we say, provided for us as a way in order to use in a far more creative, imaginative way the necessary capacity that any animal has of transforming their environment in order to transform themselves. Now that is was supposed to be the topic of my second talk, but I'm glad to have laid it on the table right here and now, because I would like to say that that is the inalienable, that is the foundation of the philosophy, shall we say, of intelligence. That is the fundamental problem. It is not the task as such of AI. Of course, it's terrifying, given the known power of AI, what might happen when that is adopted. But it's up to us, as it's always been up to us designers, to hack the systems and not simply to accommodate ourselves to them. Now, there is an instrumentalist, shall we say, ethos ever stronger in architecture. It is, let's say, one of the geniuses of somebody, I think it was, I don't know if it was Neil, maybe it was Antoine, maybe it was one of the videos I've been watching. Somebody made it very clear that architecture was different than some of the other arts, precisely because it had such a large component of a large technical apparatus, let's say, a large demand for instrumental performance. architects tend to wring their hands and be very anxious about the ways in which traditional tasks of the architect are being offloaded into other forms and systems of knowledge around us, into other sectors, let's say, of the labor market, or simply being eclipsed, if you like, by new, what people like to call paradigms. But in fact, invention that's what the architect, that's what the designer's job is. And that's something we need to figure out how we can, how we can transform our own role or our own understanding of our role from a passive one to an absolutely active one when it comes to devising the uses, but also, and this is much more important, the ecologies of the subjective ecologies of this of these developments. Now, if you don't mind for a second, I'm going to turn off my screen and see if I can quiet my house down a bit. Just give me 1 second. Hi, I'm back. So I'm going to get, I don't know how far I will get. I mean, like, this gets maybe a little more boring now, but I wanted to address the idea that I presented inadvertently yesterday of the so-called boundary problem. I said that every problem is a boundary problem. And I noticed at least 3 responses, or three of our panelists redeployed that idea in a very interesting way, each one of them, but it was not what I had meant. So I decided that I wanted to lay this down, and this gets to be a little bit a little bit pedantic, but anyway, I spoke yesterday of boundary problems. I didn't properly explain it, and I decided I would try to do so today. I tried to do that. What I'm going to present to you, oh, wait a minute. Did I ever succeed in getting my PowerPoint up? No, I didn't. I never did. No, okay, thanks for that. Okay, I'll do hand-waving arguments. How many minutes are we in? Maybe I could just stop. It doesn't matter. I'll do this presentation. Oh, I turned my phone off. We're at 11:04.
Yeah.
Wow.
If you want now, I mean.
Why don't I stop? Why don't I stop?
Okay. Okay. No, it's we're too tight on time. I mean, 2 hours for these sessions is not enough as it is. Maybe can I just pick up on something? I mean, you commented on how you are an outsider to architecture. I mean, I don't see that as a problem. In fact, maybe it's an asset in some ways. I mean, I remember once hearing Terry Eagleton going on about how Oscar Wilde had such a privileged viewpoint precisely because he was an outsider. He was Irish in an English society. He was gay in a heterosexual society. Maybe it gives you that advantage. And, you know, I think it's something also that Adorno says in his essay, Functionalism Today. In fact, all the essays in Rethinking Architecture from people outside of architecture. And I think that's the interesting thing when you get an outsider who kind of destabilizes in some ways the kind of cozy hegemony that exists within architectural discourse. I mean, I always think that architecture is a kind of a way too cozy, self-legitimizing discourse, and we need this kind of provocation. I think.
Well, let me answer that. I don't want to talk about myself, but I will say this: the outside idea was a bit of a setup as well. I totally agree with you, but I do push it even further. Remember that the actual lecture that I prepared today was all about the outside. It was really all about this boundary idea. especially as it functions in thermodynamics. And what I was about to present on the screen was a slide which I use in a lecture I used to give in a class on thermodynamics, which distinguishes between the concept of system, the concept of surroundings, and the concept of universe as it is articulated in thermodynamics. But to leave it very simply, my argument is that everything happens on the outside. My argument is we need to learn how to access the outside. We need to learn how to annex the outside. We need to learn how to refuse the notion that there is an outside. Now, that is precisely what we need to do in every case. What I wish to attempt to show is the operation of the boundary, not only in the AI problem, but in virtually every philosophical problem, in every practical problem, is the insidious and tacit, silent, often invisible, limiting operation of the boundary, which separates us from the domain of where things are revealed. Now, that is a difficult task, but you do it through description, you do it through example, and so on and so forth. The last thing I will say, because I do feel, and this is obnoxious, I totally realize it, I do feel that we are living in an era in which what used to be called theory, which was the place reserved, shall we say, for foundational thought in architecture, but as well in many other domains of learning, even in the university, the theory is being radically, shall we say, challenged or diminished. I feel we cannot survive without continually resuscitating its possibility, but also its charm, also its efficacy, also it's a form of joy. And theory needs, if you like, its prestige needs, if you like, to be recovered on all of these levels, but it needs to be continually affirmed. It does take a certain discipline. It's not for everybody, but some should be committed to it, but our culture, if you like, should also welcome it in ways that it currently doesn't. So I would like to say finally that the concept of the outside, when I began publishing with Zone Books, our first book was on the city. In fact, it was called The Contemporary City, and it attacked the city from a whole variety of transdisciplinary perspectives. But when we started our publishing program, one of the first books we published was a work by Michel Foucault and Maurice Blanchot, and it was called Thought from Outside. What it simply meant was, though, it was for us a way of declaring a whole ethos. This is back in the 1990s, a whole ethos of where understanding would come from. It comes from the outside. Thought operates on the outside. And I would just say that there's a commitment to it in every way. And I think that this problem of boundary, which is inherited from thermodynamics, is one of the most trenchant forays into understanding the physical universe. And that is really what I try to always say, is that anyone who does design, who does architecture, and who claims to be interested in the physical universe should be interested in these models. That's where I go, and that's about the end of it.
Can I just follow up with one brief comment that I was going to follow on from that, the necessity of kind of, I guess, this defamiliarization. I mean, one thought I had as you were talking was, I used this metaphor of the mirror, how AI can become the mirror in which we can think about what it is to be human. And I'm just wondering whether one can't, that's a kind of rather loose and flabby description, but I'm wondering whether one couldn't deploy the kind of Lacanian mirror stage story, you know, about what happens at the mirror stage is suddenly at the 6 months or whatever, the kid looks at itself in the mirror and sees that it's no longer part of the mother. You know, it's no longer, it had thought itself, it had been so part of it, it wasn't aware of that. And now it sees itself in this kind of alienating condition as an object within a world of objects. And I'm just wondering that maybe that's something that AI allows us to do, is to kind of step outside of this kind of background horizon in which we are kind of lost in a way we don't even perceive it, step outside and look back on ourselves. And I mean, okay, for Lacan, it was a question of then once you become separate, then you can start forming connections. But you could also possibly argue that once you become distantiated, separated or whatever, you then have a kind of, you can see yourself as it is in a different way. I don't know whether that's a useful metaphor or not, but I just wanted to kind of add that to the discussion about why defamiliarization, I think, is so important.
Well, you know, first of all, it's a very rich idea. I would like you to include a chapter in your books on AI where you revisit the mirror stage of Lacan. I know you can do one part of this for sure, and that is where instead of the shock that the child experiences when it recognizes itself in the mirror as simultaneously self and other, as he develops it, actually is being shocked by something else. Because it sees itself in its context. It realizes that it is dependent on its context, which is to say, it sees itself in its relation to the mother, but also to see the mother as, frankly, an insignificant component or portion of the broader extensa, that is to say, the world, and to see that there is this fundamental insecurity. That's to say that the child has suddenly now become an ego, and the world, if you like, is its challenge. It is the thing that it must accommodate itself to. Now, the problem here is even deeper than that, and this is the part that you would not wish to do, but which is something that where I wish to go, and it has to do with the fact that the mirror stage in Lacan is intended to be described and as a placeholder for a threshold in ontogenesis. It is meant to be a punctuation point through which we understand the formation of perspective, of attitude. That's to say, where we come to claim a singular place in the world, which is not the world itself. Now, this is a fall in the Adamic sense. This is a fall, if you like, from the beautiful immanence of the womb, shall we say, the beautiful immanence where our bodies, but also our awareness, did not recognize the boundary, if you like, which separated us from the mother. And the mother is the matrix. The mother is the world, if you like. It is the physical world. It is the world from which all sensory input, which all needs are answered, shall we say. That's to say, it is the sort of the sublime continuity. These are the foundations. In the rest of my talk, for example, what I did try to do was to say that what AI cannot do, and I say this as only provisionally, AI cannot produce that kind of computational unity. That's to say, the ontogenetic experience which receives and organizes information, which is certainly rooted in the memory of immanence, is not something that AI can do. In that sense, it doesn't have the capacity, if you like, to produce that kind of revelation or understanding. Now, I don't think that it should. What I do think is that humans in their engagement with AI, are losing their perspective of what their neural, shall we say, or their experiential capacities are. Or let's say that they are accommodating themselves to this one-dimensional reality rather than forcing, if you like, this purely instrumental aspect that has emerged before us to become integrated and transformed by our much more flexible and plastic capacity to invent the world through our perception of it. I think I said that now as well as I can.
Antoine and Marrikka, I've got a point I want to ask, but I want to pass to my colleagues first.
Okay. Marrikka, do you want to go first or should I go?
Go for it, Antoine.
Okay. I think I'm going to be very personal. I miss our conversation at Harvard, and I have the impression very often that we miss the opportunity to really understand each other, which strangely, once we're both on Zoom, gives us strangely a better opportunity. I'm really struck, how should I say, the mix of differences and similarities between what animate us. I think in the 17th century, I would have been a Cartesian very clearly, and you would have been a Gassendi. And we would have quarreled because, of course, the Cartesians usually hated the Gassendists, and conversely, though actually they shared a number of common preoccupations. I think my background is much more from mathematics and mechanics, and all these questions around life, vitalism, ecology, etc., always fascinate me and make me a little bit ill at ease. That's I love your talk. I think the central question for me was about the fact that AI is not ecological, which I think is very profound remark. And I was thinking, we've got accustomed to the idea that AI is going to swallow tons of information. For example, we'll be able to put in a huge database all the Baroque church, their dimension, their materials, etc. And AI is going just to ingest that, and it will have understood the Baroque. And I think what you're saying by the end, which is very profound, is that you can have all the data, but you're still unable to produce an ecology, which you're still unable to produce, a true living environment, which for me give birth to an interesting question, which is, how can a large database become alive or being susceptible to give life? And I think it's actually a profound question, otherwise we'll have just a collection of dead artifacts. So, and I was thinking this is actually also an urban question, etc., etc. So I think this is probably for me one of the central things I'll take from your talk, which is this idea that there is a difference between a very large database and a true ecology, which then raises for me the question, of course, of, it's not only, what is the role that history could play in making database alive and in enabling, actually, I think AI, as most of our digital tools, they can imitate history, but they have no deep understanding of the historical. So, and a system has actually a trajectory, and that's one of its characteristics. And I do think this is also quite an interesting question. Now, I liked also very much your kind of holistic thinker moment in your talk. You're an holistic thinker. And I am, as for me, always split or balancing between the holistic and a kind of taste for the separation. I'm always interested in, probably where I still remain a modern, I like the void between creatures, or and I like the idea that something somewhere is empty between two things, and that we're not in this immense living soup of everything in communication with everything, which might actually explain why for you architecture is actually completely immersed in an ocean of design. And for me, architecture is something that points both to the holistic and the separation. And that's for me a fundamental dilemma in architecture. On the one hand, yes, it points towards the holistic. On the other hand, it's still unique and producing as much separation as communication. And that's probably one of our major differences in the assessment of what architecture is. I have also to say that I love the way you describe the theorist. I think, reorganizing landscape, I think there again, your holistic thing, it's not about putting dots. Concepts are like dots. And what you want is actually to consider, once they begin to irradiate, how they constitute a landscape, and how then, I think actually this notion of landscape is quite a powerful one. I suggested myself a long time ago that the concrete world was probably better to be thought as a landscape than as a system. I'd like actually to ask you, would you make a difference between landscape and system? That's for me, that's also a question I'm not sure I'm completely clear. Also, so a lot of things which I found quite stimulating, and I'm beginning to understand, why is it that we work so often on neighboring fields and from completely different perspectives, which are strangely connected in ways or another. But as I said, I'm a Cartesian and you're a Gassendi. In the 18th century, I quoted Diderot. You might have been more on the side of Diderot, and I might have been on another side. So that's quite an interesting, I think, I was wondering yesterday, what can we do? What is unique what can we do uniquely in physical terms? But strangely, sometimes communication is made easier on Zoom.
Well, first of all, Antoine, let me go back to purely personal and nostalgic things. I don't think this will be completely uninteresting to our global viewers, is that in a way, Harvard is actually another name for missed opportunities. And
I love that.
I will tell you
That's a great
something.
one. I love that.
When I first came to the school, you maybe not remember this, when I first came to the school, it was expressed to me over and over again by people like Michael and others, is that the idea was that we would get to teach together. And it never fucking happened because of the administrative structure of the university. On the other hand, Antoine, I remember very fondly, maybe better than you do, those moments when we were brought together to do annually, again, a class together in various places and contexts, where we explored the, shall we say, the interesting space of overlap between, shall we say, and a Cartesian, and I won't use the term, I won't use the notion of Gassendi here, because I don't know enough about Gassendi, but I want to ask you to comment on this.
You would have loved him.
But I'm a Spinozist. Shall we say this, is that I am a Spinozist. That's the sense in which I am an anti-Cartesian. And
though Spinoza was much more indebted to Descartes than Gassendi. You might want to explore Gassendi.
I'm going to have to do that.
Because in Spinoza, the more geometrico is very much Cartesian still.
Oh,
it's a Cartesian approach to the whole.
the style of presentation was purely Cartesian. That I agree. On the other hand, it wasn't really. There's no doubt about it. But of course, Spinoza believed one thing primordially, and that is the mantra that a holist uses, a philosophical holist, and that is, and I'm going to say this, I'm going to pause before I say it to say it with the maximum amount of pomposity. There is only one world. Now, it is true that one may cry and one may desperately wish to produce a clearing, a gap, an empty space as you need. And I agree, I need it as badly as you do. But I don't believe it is real simply because I need it. That is number one. The next thing I'd like to say is
that's probably our difference, is that I don't care that it's real. If I need it, I just assume that it exists.
I am going to concede that you win this argument, actually.
Yes.
Now,
I agree. It's funny. Sorry. I want you to finish your thought, Sanford, but you just on the subject of nostalgia, I don't know if the people in the audience know this, but the missed opportunity that is Harvard is also my point of connection to these two guys. And I find it's very interesting to be sitting here sort of between two of my teachers and finding myself literally falling in the way that Sanford used the term, between the idea of being trapped in a world that is an inescapable soup of relations, and having at the same time the complete certainty that we are able to invent the world through our perception of it, and that if we need to invent multiple worlds in order to operate in it, we can do so. And actually, that is one of the great tasks and one of the great joys of architecture.
It's also, I have to tell you, it is one of the great joys of the Make America Great Again. And this idea of the hallucination, shall we say, is something that this was the topic of what I will do here. I was going to try to clarify and in some ways correct the mistaken formulation of Anil Seth that reality is a hallucination. I believe the hallucination has a greater reality than he gives it credit for. But I would have to say that for those who wish to reintroduce, well, to use the Whiteheadian term, a bifurcation into being or bifurcation into nature, I can only say that you'll be going against, in my opinion, you'll be going against not only our interests, but also against the progress of contemporary knowledge. To invoke this, when Antoine and Marrikka both have invoked, shall we say, well, Marrikka, I know, works on this concept. Let me just say it. We don't have a lot of time. Or at least is trying to work through a notion that she calls liveliness. And Antoine just invoked an idea about the Cartesian versus the, let's say, the Diderot concept, shall we say, of a universe, the soup, shall we say.
But I concede to Diderot that life is hard to explain if you're not in a Diderot. That what interested me in your presentation is what makes a data set alive. And I think for AI, it will be a central question. You know, how can we differentiate between a dead data set from something that may produce some form of life, between brackets?
Well, you know, Whitehead
would mean, in your terms, to have an AI who is able to function in an ecological manner.
Okay, let me jump way to the end. And this is a place I was going to be the end of my lecture today as a setup for my next lecture. if I get to do it. But it was no. What I mean by that is well, because I have other material that are steps along the way, and it never works for me if I don't do that. But the point also I wanted to say is I never really expect to get to the final frontier. And the final frontier, I want to state it right up front, just so it's on the table, just so that I don't get these opportunities to declare something and then be able to refer to it later. And that is this: mind, I wished to show, may exist outside us in the world. And that is where I find the interest in engaging, if you like, AI at this time. That's to say there's a philosophical trajectory to get there. Now, by the way, I want to see, before I go on, I don't want to forget this. Antoine, who is fairly well schooled in a lot of the science that I invoke and interpret very differently, but it doesn't matter. Antoine said something which I could have used as well as a matrix sentence. When he introduced the idea of trajectory as a foundational ontological property of ecologies, and that is absolutely true. Trajectory is an extraordinarily, it's a singular, it's a very rich physical descriptive term, because a system's trajectory is its way of embedding itself, if you like, it is because it retains aspect of its past, projects them into the future, and also meaning it is not an infinitely open, you can't, as Marrikka suggests, you can't simply sit down and invent anything you like. To pretend to do so is to be basically a creationist. If you are not a creationist, you basically have to understand that there is a pre-existing endowment that must be transformed. And upon transforming that pre-existing endowment, the pre-existing endowment is the set of organization, the features, it is the qualities and properties and the way in which they integrate and operate in the world around us. It is, in other words, the world. There is not only just one world, but it is our world. And that is not something that you can start to invent these religious, shall we say, frameworks for and say, it's no matter to me, not leave me alone while I'm trying to design. I think the time for that is past. So I have to just say that right off the bat. In his
it's funny because I was thinking, actually on Wednesday, I'm going to end on this idea that the intelligence of design may be distributed. So following another lines from you,
I'm 100% with you.
Where I want to reach. So,
well, that's, I'll tell you.
Just to clarify my own position, Sanford, I am not arguing that one can somehow just create whatever one wants without any context. But there are these really powerful moments that occur, and of course they occur in a distributed and material sense. But there are these powerful moments that occur when something either snaps together or pulls apart. And those are opportunities for creativity, a creativity that is not predetermined by ambient information, but that comes into being in a very, to go back to the term that we were talking about before, in a very spontaneous way. That's not, we make our own reality, MAGA thinking. That's simply acknowledging that we too have moments of opportunity that are there for us to take advantage of. I don't think that there's a point of disagreement here. Only maybe focusing on the individual moments, and the other one of us is focusing on the forces that bring that into possibility.
when you choose an architecture to write about, it's very often because you feel there is something in it. There's a revelation in it that has not yet, if you like, been brought into the light. That's to say, which has, and what you do as a historian, but also as a critic and as a theorist, is to try to use, shall we say, the architecture, or let's say the moment in that architecture, as an opportunity to produce revelation. But what I would like to do, at least from my own point of view, is to say that creativity is not a shopping expedition. It is actually something that is always put at the surface, if you like, of the increase in human power and human enjoyment. And that does not really, that is something that that requires, if you like, the pressure of a larger context to be active at all times, which I feel is being made as much as possible today to recede. That's all I'm really trying to say. I believe that there are practices which are asking for those demands to recede, and there are practices which are asking for those demands to assert themselves. And I would say that one has far greater resonance, for example, and also I think greater opportunity for a much broader and universal increase in the capacity for life. Now,
wait, are you talking, when you say practices there, are you actually talking about architectural practices?
Well, actually, okay, very good. I'm glad you asked that, because for now, I am wishing to remove the separation between critical practices, contemplative practices, observational practices, because let's us all agree, because the cognitive thing, frankly, is what's going on around us today, regardless. And AI, that's the other thing. It absolutely needs to understand that it is part of that massive interest now in the experiential foundation, shall we say, of the material world. So let us just say this, is that perceiving we know is active. Let's just leave it at that. This is part of a whole other lecture, but anyways, we know that that is the new fact, if you like, upon which all neuroscience is based. We know that the AI, well, okay. So I would say when I talk about practices, I'm talking about your practice. I know you do a little design, but primarily your practice as providing contexts for others to design. You're also, when you talk about brickwork in churches, what you are really doing ultimately is you are bringing a singularity, if you like, in our historical experience to the fore. You're bringing it to attention because it has the capacity, if you like, to make further, let's just say, to reveal the structure and behavior of parts of our environment that were previously not apprehensible. Now, I would like to say, just because I have to get off of the screen here, is in response to both your and I realize this, you know, in a certain sense, you are unhappily, whether you like it or not, or whether you know it or not, you're unhappily infantilized right now, clearly with Antoine and I going at it, because it certainly puts you back into the regrettable, shall we say, position that you were in when you were a student at Harvard, and you are no longer that by any means. I understand it's like when you go home to your parents, you just can't help falling into behaviors, et cetera, that you never wanted to see again. But at the same time, as a colleague, I know that you consider these problems to be of great concern. And I just want to invoke, since, you know, I have limited time in a certain sense, and I'm hoping to bring a certain, I need to, my own task is to try to create an ecology, a subjective ecology, an intellectual ecology, in which all of these points of view can have, can interact with one another, if you like, and become become useful, if you like, for design, or let's just say they can attract the concern and the attention of those who are merely mastering the technical aspects and instrumentalizing aspects of AI. In his book, in Alfred North Whitehead's book, Modes of Thought, he finishes with two extremely brilliant chapters, which in many ways outline the entire framework of his philosophy, what he calls his process, what he later called his process philosophy. And the second last chapter is where he outlines the history. I mean, you know, Antoine certainly knows resonances of these ideas, as do you, through Whitehead's more famous book, Science in the Modern World, but he articulates it in a very specific way. And he has this chapter called Nature Lifeless, where he articulates the tradition that we have inherited, the modes of thought, which is the title of his book, in which we have inculcated in ourselves, in which we have absorbed these notions, and they are fundamentally Cartesian, in which we conceive of nature as lifeless. And then he basically talks about his ontology, in which he says, in which he shows how what one must do in order to understand the world and ourselves, and in order to increase our capacities, our power in that world and in that relationship, is to think of nature as nature alive. Now, alive is your topic. You won't want the Whiteheadian version of it, but the other hand is you've got years of work to do before you find your flow in that topic. Antoine, I understand his position, really. He's a Cartesian. And by the way, Cartesianism is never going to die. However, Cartesianism, in a way, has been killed many times. And it is the Spinoza's challenge to Descartes, which I believe has found its moment in today's world. That is one that helps us, if you like, engage, in my opinion, the crises. And I would almost say the tripart crises, but I'm sure it's way more than that we are facing today. So I would say that my argument is that we have not only, we have an urgency to accept the fact that we are in a soup, and that we have a mandate and a responsibility, if you like, to produce solutions for our destiny in that soup. Thanks.
And I agree. It's you know, strangely, I don't disagree about what the world may be. It's more that in terms of action, you know, I would rather define myself as probably a kind of Spinoza-Deleuzian in terms of the way I believe the world is, and a Cartesian in terms of the method to act in the world. You know, so that's for me more related to the question of action, that the world is a soup, or, you know, something which seemed probably better described as a continuum of action, reaction, systems, overlapping, interpenetrating, etc. I don't disagree. But then as a human being, I think, you know, the philosophy of action may be slightly different. I'm always struck by the fact that actually we, you know, you can describe the world in one way and actually use another frame to act, which is a little bit, I think, I'm more Cartesian in those terms. But actually, I agree that we have to accept that the world is probably more continuous, etc. So I don't disagree on that. It's more that, you know, it's very hard to be a completely, although Spinoza tried to address that, but to be an acting Spinozist is a little bit difficult at times.
Well, okay, that's a task. You know, my approach to Spinoza.
It's Sanford. If I could just build on that, just to kind of infuriate you a little bit more, but if I could just build on that too, I wonder. I agree. I find it very difficult to act in soup mode. And I also think it's difficult to do architecture in soup mode. And I wonder if there's something about the kind of specific agency of architecture that needs to kind of establish the fiction of the boundary, or the fiction of the edge, or the fiction of the sphere in which one has a kind of stake and one has a kind of, to go back to Antoine's point, inhabitation, in order to get one out there in the soup, in a way.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just say that the soup was fun to talk about, but it is not an adequate representation of the ontological system. Now, the soup was basically a moment where we were saying, look, we talk about, for example, the pandemic, and everybody used to use everybody used, and the wearing of masks, and so on and so forth. And everybody used to use the trope of a swimming pool and saying that it is not okay to say that you can pee in the pool at one end of the pool and not be affecting everybody. Now, it is true that this concept of soup has its origins at the very, very, very beginnings of thought. The concept of the apeiron in the early Greeks and the pre-Socratics was the notion of the undifferentiated, which was understood to be, if you like, the underlying foundation of what of how we can understand the operation of the world. And the idea was that there was this domain where everything was undifferentiated, and the task was to explain how precisely, and this is the term, the logos, actually differentiates the world and produces what we see around us. That's to say, the wonderful variety of experience. The approach to okay, so how much can we pull the wool over our eyes and say that architecture is a cultural practice? Because I believe that I've examined it. Is there a belief in your mind operating somewhere that suggests that our cultural practices can be somehow separated or somehow ontologically extracted from our, as Gibson would have said it, if you like, how vision or how information pickup from the world can be separated from the eye in the head, in a body standing on the ground and moving over a surface. The question, of course, is, can we continue to believe that there is more than one world? And what use is it for us? Now, to say that we can't design from within the soup, I completely disagree, because the soup does not provide any special obstacles. What it does do, of course, is make us realize that by drawing boundaries, we don't posit, well, for example, when it comes to sustainability, are we going to continue to believe that a roster of the energetic, a roster, what I mean by that is a balance sheet of how much energy a building uses, actually describes its impact, if you like, on what a thermodynamicist would call the surrounding, or shall we say, of the universe? No, because the energetic cost of the building is all in externalities. Now, we know that externalities and the way in which they are exported, are we gone? Are we over? No. Externalities is what is the most pressing problem that we have today. So I would want to ask Marrikka how you would account for the habit of mind that is continually exporting externalities or exporting entropy outside of the system in order to have a more comfortable and complacent feeling about how of what life inside of the system would be. would you be sure that you are not actually committing greater crimes, shall we say, to the environment simply by creating, shall we say, happy and beautiful buildings, because you define the boundary as being one that is necessary for architecture? How would you like produce a kind of an ethical position for the design that you're interested in? Oh, so, ethical. I don't mean ethical in the terms of moral. I just mean ethical in terms of how would you create an argument for it, which acknowledges, if you like, those features, that those aspects. That's to say, the aspects of which any design basically has an impact, if you like, a willed impact, and even impacts that it doesn't see as part of its intention.
So it seems to me like maybe we're conflating a couple of things that maybe we need to be careful about. So on the one hand, you could say that architecture is a discipline of boundary, going back, say, to Alberti and the architecture of the wall, and that constructing those boundaries is one way that we create moments of high differentiation in a negentropic way in the world. On the other hand, you could say that the production of those boundaries, whether they're psychological or whether they're physical or whether they're environmental, are always sort of partial and are never ultimately able to form bubbles that exist outside the rest of everything else, or create an inside that is separated from the outsides that are all around everything else. And I think to characterize it the way you did, that somehow there's a kind of architectural crime that's committed against the larger environment is maybe a bit misleading, and it may be a bit simplistic. And actually, it might go toward exactly the kind of ledger that you just pointed out, and very rightly so, is completely inadequate. The idea that somehow there's a zero-sum game and a ledger that always has to be added up, so that the things that you take out of a system have to then be put back into the system, is really, I think, a problematically anthropocentric perspective. As if we could say exhaust the sun, or exhaust the stardust of our shared material with the rest of the universe. And actually, part of the problem with the architectural imagination right now is a deep kind of sense of I think misplaced guilt, that somehow architecture is responsible for depleting the world. And as if it could be depleted.
Well, first of all, well taken. Your point, very, very well taken. I certainly would never want to be identified with that point of view. And as you probably know, I have a book coming out on the sun very soon that I'm doing with Kiel Mo, which began at Harvard. In fact, which is meant to be. It was meant to basically throw that very gauntlet down that you just threw down at me. We don't have much time, but I would like to throw one thing in before all of our people got off, and that is this, is that fascinatingly to me, is your use of the word bubbles. And because one of the things that I was very surprised by about 10, 15 years ago, was why the architecture schools and the consciousness of architecture did not embrace this extraordinary, but also messy and in many ways problematic work of Sloterdijk, who brilliantly formulated, even in the 3 titles of his trilogy, Foams, Bubbles, and Spheres, a wonderful, let's say, articulation of the problem we're discussing today, and why, for example, that work in all of its messiness did not attract the attention of architects, which I think merited much more, but rather some of this sort of internet philosophy that arose very soon afterward, which for some reason or other began to interest and attract architects. I refer to what was known as speculative realism and this kind of return to Aristotelian, Kantian assurances and myths. So for me, for some reason, I wonder, what was it? Why does that happen? I mean, that's not something I have an answer to, but I would like to say that in your invocation of these, of those terms, I believe those things also help to change, generally speaking, to help the mentality. I think even the idea, to go back to it, even the simple idea of trajectory, let alone all of the other terms and all of the other ones I would have wanted